Okay, welcome to the Quilters Hall of Fame. Our current exhibit is the American Quilt Study Group's exhibit of 200 years of solid color. We're honored to have with us here Maida, and she is visiting. She is one of the artists who made one of the quilts, actually this quilt behind us. Hi Maida.
Hi.
Thank you for driving over today. What'd you say?
5 hours.
5-hour drive.
Yeah, from
wow.
Athens, Ohio.
So we appreciate you coming.
Oh, it's worth it.
Okay.
The exhibit is phenomenal.
Can you tell us a little bit about the American Quilt Study Challenges?
Well, every other year they have a challenge that American Quilt Study Group members can participate in. The quilt can only be 42 inches large. It can't be more than 42 inches. It's a smaller version of a quilt that you're studying, or a take on the quilt in some way, like it inspires you to do something. Many people do sort of miniatures of the original quilt, which is really fun, and that's what I did. I tried to capture everything as authentic as I could, from the fabrics to the binding to the backing, the quilting design, so it's kind of like a miniature of the original. We have to have permission to use the original, so if it comes from a museum or a private collection, you do have to have permission. And some individuals will use their own quilts in their own collections. Many American Quilt Study Group members collect antique quilts. That's what we do, and we study them. So I chose this typical Amish quilt from Pennsylvania, and it's called a center diamond, or the diamond in the square. And I selected it from this book when I decided to do the challenge. I knew I wanted to do something in wool, and this quilt face, or the quilt top, is in wool. I looked through the book, and Colonial Williamsburg has a wonderful collection of quilts, all different types of quilts. They have whole cloth real early. Of course, Colonial Williamsburg was, is a lot about our early history. So there's many whole cloth quilts, and there's Amish quilts. Different communities quilted different types of quilts. So one reason I chose the quilt out of here is because I take trips to Virginia, and I've been to Colonial Williamsburg, and I have Mennonite ancestry, and my question was, could one of my Mennonite ancestors have made this quilt? And the other thing I wanted to do was to investigate the wool fabrics. Wool fabrics are fascinating. My husband and I have raised sheep for 50 years, and I love wool, and I spin wool, and I do lots of things with wool. That's where I selected my idea on what I wanted to do for my project.
Okay, so then did you go and see
Yes.
the quilt that you...
My first step was to call Colonial Williamsburg, the collections department, and ask to see this particular quilt, and I had to give them the number of the quilt and the description of the quilt. And every quilt in museum collections all have an ascension number, and that's how they keep track of what's what and where it is. And then I made an appointment, so on that day and that time that I set up, I went to Colonial Williamsburg, and I went to the collections, the building where they're all housed, and they had it laid out on a table for me, ready to examine. I had to wear gloves, and I wasn't allowed to touch it, except one time where I could turn up the corner and I could inspect the back and the binding and the corner treatment for the binding and how the binding was applied, because I wanted to know all those details to be able to reproduce it. A lot of people don't know that museums aren't just for exhibition, they are also for research. And if you make an appointment and they have something in their collections that you are studying or want to see very close, up close, take pictures, you can make an appointment, and they will bring that item out and you can study it. So I did. I looked up close, I took a magnifying glass, I took my camera, and to get the true colors of the quilt, we had to turn the lights off in a black room. And I used the museum setting on my camera, just a little cheap digital, and I got some real nice pictures.
Okay.
So, and then afterwards, I went across the yard in the building beside that, and that is the John D. Rockefeller Jr. Library. And I continued research in their library. So.
Okay. And did you mention what year the quilt you used was made?
It's made between 1920 and 1940, so it doesn't have an exact date. And that date is identified by the design, the textiles, both on the front and the back, and how it was made.
Right.
And what was typical in that time period.
Okay. And was it in pretty good shape?
It was in excellent shape. Now, what's interesting is the blue in my quilt is very bright. The blue in the original, the study quilt, was more of a teal, and it was kind of faded. And when I was working on the fabrics, I did dye the fabrics to make this quilt and to make it like it was. And I hung it on the wall, and I did the center part, and I hung it up on the wall, and I thought, oh my gosh, if I'm gonna hang this in my house, I really don't like that teal. And it was kind of blah. So I took it apart, and I re-dyed some other fabric to get a brighter blue that I knew I could live with.
Tell us about the fabrics.
That was quite interesting. I was very interested in the fabrics. When I saw the picture of the quilt in here, I knew it was wool, but I didn't know what type of wool. And in fact, on your exhibit here at the Marie Webster House, there are many wool. There's several wools.
Yes.
Yes, in solid color quilts, you can find wool often in solid color quilts, because the other choices are usually plaid. So it's quite fascinating. So when I studied them, I noticed there was a twill and there was a crepe fabric. So I went to research those two fabrics. Were they true of that period of time, and what were they like? Well, I have a stash of wool fabrics at home, and I dug through, and I was able to find enough yardage in twill, and a twill weave and a crepe weave to do this quilt. So it is true to the fabrics, except what I learned is that the fabrics of that time, the twill was called serge, and the crepe is called crepe. And they are very tightly woven, very harsh, very durable fabrics. And that's probably why the Amish used them. The fabrics, those same fabrics in my stash, were a softer weave. And that's why I used a wool batting in this quilt, because I wanted to get definition. I knew that my quilting stitches would sink into a softer weave. And on a harsher weave, they would stay on the top, so you could see it on the original study quilt. So I had to really think about how I could show the quilting as well as just the design of the quilt, because their quilting is really unique.
Right, and in your quilt, the quilting is outstanding.
Well, thank you.
So, yes.
And I think a lot of that is attributed to the wool batting.
The wool batting, yep.
Where the fabrics sink into the fabric, they also kind of sink into the batting, and you can makes the unquilted parts kind of puff up. To clarify what I was looking at, I had gone to Shipshewana that same year to a Midwest Fabric Study Group meeting. Goshen College has an exhibit hall in their library, and they had wool quilts up, so I thought, I'm going to go look. Well, one wall was of little girls' serge and crepe dresses.
Wow.
Well then, lo and behold, you know, all of us in the American Quilt Study Group love antique shops. And I did find a little Amish crepe, wool crepe dress. You see that?
Yeah.
And this little dress, now the buttons tell the date. The buttons are 1920 glass buttons that were very popular in the 1920s, maybe early 1930s. So it clarified for me the difference between their crepe fabrics and my fabrics were probably 1980s. Actually, the pumpkin was an old Pendleton, white Pendleton crepe women's jacket that I was able to dye. And it was beautiful. I hated to cut it up, but it had a big stain on it, and it was not coming out, and it was right in the front, and so the whole jacket was ruined. Well, it has a new purpose.
Yes.
And
yes.
So I could really begin to inspect the serge and these, both of them, the new fabrics and these earlier fabrics, were a worsted wool, which is a process given to wool fibers. There's an extra step in there. The fibers are carded and combed, and they have a tight twist. And this is a very, very lightweight, very sturdy fabric.
Mm-hmm. So then how did you work through your project?
Well, after studying the fabrics, then I had to start into and selecting my fabrics. I had to start into both making the quilt, dyeing the fabric, and then putting it together. So first I worked on the pattern. The pattern was fairly easy to make because this is about 1/4 of the original. So all I had to do was reduce everything a fourth. Well then, and it took a while even to make sure you get the corner triangles right and they fit in and they, they're not bulky and they fit smoothly. Then I found in the 3 patterns from different sources between 1980 and 1990 where I could have bought the pattern or found it in a magazine. Yeah. So anyhow, my pattern was already made. But what happened, in about 1970, the antique dealers discovered Amish quilts. And there were some artists that discovered Amish quilts, and they started to buy them up in the Amish communities. Yep. And so they entered the English world. And then, of course, we see patterns starting to come out for those quilts. Because what I discovered, this pattern is unique to Lancaster County, Pennsylvania.
Oh, okay.
3 Midwest Fabric Study members, one who is Amish, one who is Mennonite, and one who lives in Pennsylvania and is an excellent historian on German Pennsylvanian Amish quilts and Mennonite quilts and all the different religious sects and communities. They all said they did not know of anyone who ever made this quilt outside of Lancaster, Pennsylvania. It's interesting, and I did not know that. You always see this in antique books. And when we started into the quilt documentation projects for each state, they often will show up if that documentation is in a community where Amish are living. And the thing is, they did say, but you can find them in Ohio, Indiana, maybe further west, where Amish have settled, because they would have been given as gifts. Right. And so they would have traveled west as a gift to start their new home. Then my next thing was to work on the colors, and that was the most fun. Dyeing the fabrics, and it's really messy, but it's really interesting to put fabric into a dye bath and try to get it to come out the way you want it. It never does, but you attempt. So my first go, I had to make several swatches, and I kind of played around with color combinations. And to get that teal, I started with the blue, and if you add the complement, it tones it down, which it did. And then I had to add some green to make it kind of the teal color, and I got it right, but it wasn't pretty in the quilt, my quilt. So I decided to brighten it up and make it bluer. Yeah. And that was really fun. So the purple in here, I started with a light blue piece I had, and I was able to dye that purple pretty easily. And the pumpkin, which I mentioned, was an old white crepe jacket that was easy to dye. I had to add a little red to the orange to get it bright. I had to have my dye bath pretty intense to be able to get intense colors. And this is why antique dealers and artists exhibiting quilts really were drawn to Amish quilts, because the solid colors, they're intense colors, they're so vivid and graphic, and they're fun to look at. So, and also I had the question, everybody says, oh, the Amish are very frugal and the Mennonites are frugal, and farmers are very frugal, so they usually use scraps to make their quilts. Well, not really true. Gretchen Schultz is a Midwest Fabric Study member, and she's the historian from Pennsylvania. She explained to me the story about the jobbers. And jobbers were like salesmen, and they would load up supplies that farm families in the communities away from the cities, out in the rural areas, would need, and they would sell them, from their wagon or their truck or whatever they had. Jobbers were they were called jobbers because they worked in the cities, and they were able to locate supplies that were like maybe out of date, and the Amish usually take on English things after they're out of fashion in the English world. And she said they would buy bolts of fabric, and they would use it for the clothes, like the little girl's dress, but save enough for their planned
their
quilt.
quilt.
And so that would have been new fabric. It wouldn't have been old fabric. And you imagine that 4 times bigger.
Right.
That's big pieces of yardage.
Yes.
And so they did. They bought their fabrics and they didn't use scraps necessarily in this particular quilt. Now scraps might have come maybe for some of the squares, but the square is also the triangle, and that's a lot of fabric. So every one of those except the pumpkin. And the pumpkin, for me, was recycled fabric. So,
It doesn't look recycled. It's beautiful.
Oh, thank you. It was really fun. I was surprised I got that bright orange. I didn't think I'd be able to acquire the brightness. And in the original quilt, the orange was bright, but the teal blue, you know, and it could have been faded. Wool doesn't fade like cotton. It doesn't fade as easily as cotton, but it will fade. And because the dye penetrates the outer layer of the wool fiber, which is covered sort of like in scales, and it can penetrate the fiber, and the scales help protect it from the dye washing away. But I have had wool items that when you wash them, they fade, and most of that came from the new synthetic dyes.
What kind of dyes do you use?
I use Cushing dyes, and a lot of people like other kinds of dyes. There's many different types of home dyes. I like Cushing. They come in little packets. They're easy to acquire. They're very easy to use. You can combine them, the colors, very easily. And it's just sort of what I started with, so it's what I do use.
Okay.
And the binding on here was a rust. So I might have started with a red. I can't remember what I used. I know I didn't have rust fabric, so I either started with the red and toned it down maybe with its complement, or I might have started with something else. I have quite a few fabrics in my stash. So then the next thing I worked on was the quilting. And I had to take real good pictures in the museum to be able to reproduce the quilting. But what I found, the quilting is very common. And you can find it in pictures, different places. The hardest was the rose in the purple. And it was kind of unique how the center rose and then there's 2 buds on each side. So it was similar but a little different. And then when I was in Shipshewana, I met Mrs. Miller. And we went out for dinner at their, they gave a dinner. You could quilt a little bit on the quilt frame. And in fact, the quilts we were quilting on, we could put our name. If we quilted, we signed it with a pen on the quilt. And then we put our name in a hat, and if our name was drawn, they gave away 3 quilts.
Wow.
But they had 4 set up. And so 1 was going back to the community and 3 were going to be given away. You know what? Every one of them was solid colors, cottons, and really bright and really colorful.
Wow.
I didn't realize that they were still doing their own personal quilting in solid colors and many different colorful quilts. So anyhow, I was asking her questions because I was doing this quilt study, and she said, told me how to make the feathers. She said, oh, don't worry about a pattern. Yeah, she said, just draw a curved line, an undulating line, and then put your feathers on it. And I did, and it was really easy. I was amazed. So those are freehand drawn.
Yay, very nice.
Yeah.
So from the quilt that you were looking at, your inspiration quilt, your quilting is exactly the same, just reduced down in size.
Yep, and I was showing my friend who came here to see the exhibit with me. Right here are little scallops, and they're really hard to see because they're little. Yep. I knew you couldn't see them very well, but they were in the original quilt, so I put them in there because I wanted it to be like the original. So I had to get this spacing, and I had to get this curl, and it kind of comes around there. And there's actually a star thingy in here and here. And then these are 4 little lobes. It's sort of like a cross. So, yeah, it was fun. The hard part was the circle. Getting the feathers
and the star in
to come out around the circle. So the quilting was interesting. Oh, another thing about the quilting, I am studying threads, and particularly embroidery threads. So I have been watching over the years. I've been watching for threads, and when I go antiquing or an antique and vintage threads. Well, I now have a box of 1940s rust-colored quilting thread, and I used it in here, so the quilting thread in here is really authentic, and so I thought that was kind of cool. And they used dark-colored quilting threads.
Right.
Blacks, browns, and this is a rust. And it was a rust. It wasn't a brown, it was actually a rust in the original quilt. So that was kind of like the dress. These odd things kept happening to help this study.
So could one of your ancestors actually have made this quilt?
You know, that was one of my main goals, to try to find that out when I decided to take this particular quilt. And that's because my ancestors on my mother's side are first generation and second generation immigrants, but not Mennonite or Amish. They're just, I think they were German Reform before World War II, and then of course everything German went to the wayside. In fact, they spoke German in the house until that time period. But on my dad's side of the family, they came over in the 1700s. My grandmother, Myrtle Zimmerman, came over in the early 1700s. So she was actually, her family, not her family was actually the first wave of Amish into Pennsylvania. And they settled in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and I understand, I went searching over there for the Zimmerman name, and you find it all over the place. But her family is her ancestors came into Lancaster. And the reason I learned from this research that the Amish are so heavily settled in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, is because a lot of people came into Philadelphia, but they were too crowded for farmers, and they were Welsh, because William Penn was a Quaker, a Welsh Quaker. And so that's interesting too, because you find this style of quilt in the historical books in Great Britain that are Welsh quilts. So we think, well, some of the books mention that perhaps this particular quilt was made by the Amish, inspired from their Welsh neighbors.
Oh.
But anyhow, this is a picture, if you can see that, of my grandmother and grandfather. And this is my grandmother, Myrtle, and this is my grandfather, Elmer Shuttler. Now, the Shuttlers came after the Revolutionary War in the 1790s and went, I don't have any record where they were anywhere in eastern Pennsylvania. It looks like they went immediately to western Pennsylvania. And I did go to the Historical Society in the county where they came. And my aunt had done some preliminary genealogy. And what I found is that they had a daughter that does not show up in her research, and she does not show up in Ohio. And it looks like she was born and perhaps died. And maybe that's why they came into Ohio, or so I found a little bit more information about the Shuttler family, and more about the Zimmerman family being from Lancaster, Pennsylvania. So by the time, so they came to Ohio in the early 1800s, both families. I'm not sure where Grandma and Grandpa met, but somehow they met in the Amish area of Ohio. They settled in Stark County, and there are some in Tuscarawas County. But today, there are Shuttlers who are Mennonites and Amish all over up in the area of the Amish country. She had a sister. She died actually in 1920 of the flu. And so her sister was actually the grandmother I knew. And that was not uncommon for families at that time, where if the sister wasn't betrothed to somebody, that she, may become the wife if her sister died. And so they needed somebody to take care of the three children. One was my dad. But they had another sister. Of course, they had lots of children in the family. The Zimmerman family picture is pretty big. And she was known as the quilter in the family. And I have some quilt blocks that we know that she did, that my mother had saved and gave to me when she knew I was interested in quilting. So the question is, could she have made this quilt? The answer is no, because not likely. Because for one thing, the historians say that this was not made out of Lancaster County. It might have traveled out of Lancaster County, but was not made outside Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. And by the time she was here in Ohio, all the samples I have are cotton, and they're much more intricate. They're not simple and basic like this.
Mm-hmm.
So this quilt, not only because of the design, is unique to Lancaster County, but also because it's wool.
Right.
And also because the real wide border, now you don't see it here, but in the original quilt, these quilts have a wider border than the typical Pennsylvania German quilt. And they say that is also unique to Lancaster County. So this is some of the research I found as I read about this particular quilt. So nope, she didn't make it. And it is unique to Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. And I learned quite a bit about the fabrics.
Yes.
Especially the crepe and serge. And the thread, yes, yes.
Well, thank you, Maida, for coming and talking to me today.
You're welcome.
Appreciate it.